folks, thank you all so much for joining us for our virtual version of Saturday evening entertainment. I'm really excited about this opportunity to have this panel discussion on the film Sipe, Sex, Lies, and the Priesthood, and especially excited to have the opportunity to discuss it with these folks, Tom Doyle, Terry McKiernan, and Joe Cultrera, who I'd like to invite to turn on your cameras and your mics. Thanks for joining us, guys, on your Saturday evening. I really appreciate this. So to kick off the discussion, I'm hoping this is kind of a free-flowing kind of thing. We have some questions in advance. Some of our survivors in the network submitted some questions to us. And I also hope those of you watching will make use of the chat and Q&A function and ask things as things come along. But I'd invite our folks to introduce themselves, maybe start us off by explaining, what your role was in the film, or, how you enjoyed working with Richard. Terry, I'm going to call on you to start off.
Sure. I'm Terry McKiernan. I'm the co-founder of bishopaccountability.org and the co-producer of the movie. And I'm very, very grateful to Snap for hosting it and to all of you for watching it. And I first got to know Richard in 2003 when I cold called him and asked him if I could use a quote from a speech that he gave in Louisville as the kind of call letters of bishopaccountability.org's very first homepage. And he was very willing to do that. And our friendship developed. And over the years, I would visit him and Marianne out in La Jolla. And I learned so much from Richard over the years, as we all did. So I'm really very happy that we were able to bring him to you in this form, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
And I'm grateful to you for producing that. Thanks. Joe, why don't you go ahead?
I am Joe Cultrera. I'm a filmmaker, and what Terry didn't mention is he was also the producer of the film, and Terry hired me to direct and edit the film. I had made a previous film called Hand of God that dealt with clergy abuse through the story of my family, my brother, and had become acquainted with the movement, obviously, and Bishop Accountability through that. And so that's how Terry and I knew each other and got on the road to making this film.
Wonderful. Thanks, Joe. We'll ask more about that process in a minute, but Tom, go ahead. Round us out here.
Okay, I'm Tom Doyle, and I didn't found anything. I've been around this issue for 37 years, so I guess the fact that I've survived the attempts to make me not exist says something in itself. I don't really remember when I first met Richard, but I can tell you this: it was in the very early 90s, at least. If not before. We were together, the first time we performed, I guess you call that, together was in 1992 at the very first gathering of survivors of clergy sexual abuse in Chicago that was run by Gene Miller, who was the founder of, at the time was called Vocal, and then they changed the name to the Link Up. And Richard gave one of his classic speeches at that gathering, which had several hundred people at it. It was the first time. Then over the years, Dick and I, our relationship continued to grow both professionally and personally. On the professional side, we both were expert witnesses and consultants on countless cases that we worked together. And whenever we worked a case together, as preparing expert reports, I never worked as well with any other human being as I did with Richard. I think there was something about the syncretism that happened with the two of us, that we would be talking to each other, and especially if Marianne was involved, his wife, we would come up with ideas and things of that nature that I would never have been able to come up with on my own, but we did. But Richard and I worked together for I don't know, 25, 30 years, giving talks. The most important thing for me, though, was that was the vehicle that enabled me to develop an extremely unique and special relationship with this man.
Yeah.
He was my closest friend. We were closer than blood brothers, I think. We felt that way. And I think he's one human I've met that I totally trusted, completely trusted. And I knew I could say anything to him, and anything that I did or said, he would be supportive. So that's the basis. And then we worked together over the years. We co-authored a book together. We did articles together. But the basic thing, the most important thing to me, is we spent quality time, is an understatement, together. Either out east or I went out whenever I had to go west for anything, a trial or a deposition. I always made sure that I would route myself around San Diego and spend time with Richard and Marianne at La Jolla.
Yeah. Well, you know, that listening to you speak, Tom, makes me want to switch my gears a little bit. I was going to initially just ask Terry and Joe about how the idea for the film came out, but I guess what I want to ask you what it was like, given how close and how, you know, how close you and Richard were and how long you worked together. What was it like for you to watch this film? I mean, just for me, who knows someone like Richard from afar and just in admiration of his work, what really struck me was how the film pulled out not just his depth of character and duty, but his kindness. I thought that really showed through in the film and struck me, but I'm interested in what stuck out to you.
All of the above, but just, it was, I guess I had a different reaction than probably most. Maybe the only person who would have a close reaction like I did would be Marianne, his wife.
Sure.
It was extremely emotional for me.
Yeah.
Just to see him, and to see him the way I knew him, you know, smiling. I don't remember him, even when he was sick, that he didn't have, his sense of humor wasn't there, his kindness. That was the main thing. He had incredible depth of love and kindness in him for all kinds of people. And it amazed me. It amazed me. But watching the film, which was very, very real,
Yeah.
for me, extremely well done, Joe. I mean, I think it was a masterpiece. And I'm not saying that because Richard was my closest friend. I'm saying that because of what it was. You brought out who he is. The only thing you couldn't possibly have captured, I saw him a couple times at trial. And, you know, the warm and fuzzy and teddy bear like Richard Sipe could turn into a tiger if the lawyers pushed the wrong buttons.
Yeah.
And I saw that happen more than once. And he was passionate about what he believed in. He was passionate about his vocation of helping survivors, very passionate. And that came out. He never lost sight of what it was all about.
Joe, go ahead. You looked like you want to jump in there.
No, I would have loved to have that opportunity to find that level of being with him in a courtroom and recording that would have been incredible. There's lots of things like that after you've made a film you wish you had the opportunity to do, but you know, it's the evolution of this film really was Terry, you know, knowing at one point that Richard was in ill health and wanting to record his story before we didn't have him. And so that was really the initial idea, was just to go and spend some time with him and interview him in depth at his home. And then when he was traveling to Minnesota, that seemed a good follow-up to spend time with him in his home state and where he went to school. And then the film just kind of sat on a hard drive, or the footage sat on a hard drive for a long time, years. And till at one point I came home. I was in between paying jobs, and I saw the hard drive sitting there with his name on it, and it's like, this is such a shame that we don't at least explore the possibility of doing something with this. I'm not sure what it can be, because it was interviews and some B-roll that we had shot there, and so I just sat with it for a couple of weeks and kind of laid out some. It had its own orbit that had to be found, and it just kind of found itself in those 2 weeks. And I got in touch with Terry. I said, I've just been messing around with this stuff. I think there's actually a film here. We just need to do a little follow-up shooting, and I think we have something. So that's kind of how the film came along. And had it been approached differently, we probably would have been at trial with him and done other things. But that was kind of the real initiative was just grabbing what we could, and then it found itself after that. Terry?
Yeah, what a wonderful serendipity it was. Huh? I thought of you, Joe, as you mentioned, because I love Hand of God so much. And Hand of God is a very, very unusual clergy abuse movie because there are no talking heads. There are no experts. And you're just embedded in the family. And it's an extraordinary experience as a result. And I think what happened with this film in a way is that you embedded with the expert and brought him in his hospitable home self to people who might not have had that experience otherwise. And that's really precious, And I think you also just have this gift for being with people and just helping them, waiting for them to reveal themselves. And this movie is the beautiful result.
It really is. It's a joy to watch. It handles this difficult topic that people often don't want to talk about, and I think it's the kind of thing that you could get anybody who doesn't know something about Richard into the film. It's very approachable. It's beautiful to look at. I was taking some notes as I read, Joe, and as I watched, Joe, and one of the things I put down was cogs working in the background in the shot of Basilica. Wow, with 4 exclamation points. So some of those background, I just found it a joy to watch. So one thing I wanted to ask, I guess, sort of about the process of making the film was, as you're going through all the footage and the conversations that you've had with Richard over and over and over again as you're putting this together, did you have any initial impressions that may have changed as you're going through or reading these kind of things, or something that maybe deepened in your admiration or thought about Richard making it?
For me, it was really just his humanity and his sense of humor and the relationship between him and Marianne. And, just we are basically the cameraman that I was working with, Hugh Walsh, who also shot Hand of God, but basically the crew was the 2 of us and a local sound person. We kept it very small because we were kind of going into Richard's house and setting up shop there for a few days. And we're almost like living out of there. We were spending so much time there. And then Marianne and him were treating us, making us dinner or taking us somewhere where we ate together. And it was just a wonderful experience kind of getting to know them and seeing their relationship. And for somebody who's dealing with such a serious issue, Tom mentioned his sense of humor, and that really was something that was really important, I think, for the film and for when it was revealing to me. I like Hand of God also, I always felt was a funnier movie than it should expect it to be, even though it's not a funny movie at all. But one thing that sometimes gets lost in these films about abuse is that people still have that humanity, still have that humor. To disregard that and only talk about the pain is missing the point of who people are. And I was happy that some of that was coming through in the footage when I went back and looked at it, and I was able to hold on to some of that.
That's really great. Speaking of who people are, I thought this might be a good time to show that picture that you sent me, Tom. I thought so. Tom sent me a picture he wants to show of Richard in action here, and as we were discussing, this side of Richard wasn't really shown in the documentary so much. But Tom, I was wondering maybe if you could talk to us about this.
This picture was taken, I believe, in 2015 or 2014, Richard and I were both, excuse me, expert witnesses at the murder trial of John Fite. John Fite had been a priest. He was originally an oblate, and then he became a paraclete, and then he left. And John Fite raped and murdered a girl, maybe now 63, 64 years ago. And he was never brought to accountability because of a collusion between the church and the civil officials in very South Texas. They got a new district attorney down there, and one of the things he ran on was justice for Irene Garza. And they got two young assistant DAs who pursued this, and they were magnificent. And they contacted both Richard and I, and we became involved. This was taken at the trial. Richard, I believe, testified before I did, but I was at the back of the room watching him testify. I'm not sure who took the picture. Somebody did, but I have to tell you, he was at his best that day. He was really something. John Fite was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He died this past year at the age of, I think, 87 or 88, and he died in prison. And ironically, and I think very sadly, no one came to claim his body, not his wife or his children or anyone. And so he's buried at the Huntsville prison. But that was Richard. We were down there for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days. Dick, Marianne, myself, and Paul Livingston, who came along to help make sure Richard got around okay. And we had a, in spite of the fact that we were not in the playground of the stars down there in South Texas, we did have a good time in spite of why we were there. And as I said, Richard, he was always at the top of his game as far as I could see. I always saw him on top of things, never depressed or sad, even when he was sick. And that's where that picture came from. That was, in a way, you know, we've said that was his last hurrah. That was his last public the time he was in public. He didn't give a speech, he gave testimony for several hours, but I think that was the last time. I've talked to Marianne, and she said she thinks so too.
Yeah. I had the good fortune to be in McAllen for the trial. And so there's another angle on this, which is, Tom, that it was my opportunity to see you and Richard doing your thing together, which was amazing. And you complemented each other so beautifully in the trial. And the trial was highly significant because Fite, people may remember, when he was a servant of the Paraclete, he actually processed, among other offenders, James Porter, and sent James Porter out to assignments where he offended against children. And it was those offenses in the 60s that ultimately led to the explosion of clergy abuse in the Southwest. So you and Richard both were examining, in a way, that crucial moment long ago, the time when Irene Garza was murdered in 1960 and those years afterwards. It was really quite an awesome trial, and with a good, long delayed result.
I don't think most people that are in the movement today, the Justice for Survivors movement, I don't think most people really appreciate, and I'm not saying this to be critical or pejorative, the whole reality of that nightmare with John Fite, because there's so many moving parts. David Holly was involved in that. The Paracletes were involved in that. New Mexico, which was the epicenter of sexual abuse in the early 90s, when Richard and I got started. That's where the action was, so to speak. But I'd like to say that I think Richard, I think in the long run, I can see this now. I think he changed history in many ways. And it's something that a lot of people don't know about. But Richard was involved in this nightmare way before it hit the surface. He was involved in it back in the 60s, the early 60s, when he was at Seton Institute. He and Marianne were there together. Richard had the courage, and I think I said this, used this analogy at his memorial service. He got into a bulldozer, turned that baby on, and he drove it through this massive wall of denial and protection that the institutional Catholic Church had created. And he was the only man that could have done that because of the work he had done and his deep, profound, and insightful understanding of the whole complexity of clerical celibacy and clerical life. And he was able to explain that. And he also, I'm sure it's been said before, but he was one of the first ones to blow the whistle on McCarrick. He wrote to the Holy See about McCarrick years and years ago, before anybody, even before he was on anybody's radar. And of course he was ignored. And the only time we ever knew that his letters actually were read was when Archbishop Vigano sent that letter out in August of 2018 and specifically mentioned Richard. And I've always said, if they had listened to him at one point or other, a lot of things would have been different. But as I'm working now on I'm working on my speech for tomorrow, but it's part of a bigger project that Marianne and Richard and Pat Wall and I have been involved in for 20-some years. And that's kind of like as deep as you can get an understanding of why this happens. And is where I'm at now, having gone through all this massive amount of medieval doctrine or documentation. A lot of things Richard said, his insights, weave in and out of this constantly. And it's helping me put the whole thing together in a way I never was able to do before. And then one last thing on this, Dick, and I used to go out there a lot to La Jolla. And I think he and Marianne, his wife, and I would sit at the kitchen table for hours and hours and hours and discuss. And in the course of those discussions, I think we probed deeper than probably anybody has into this issue. And I would say that because I'm sitting there with two incredible intellects. And the one thing I do want to make sure I say is that Marianne Sipe was as much a part of this struggle, of the success of it, as I was, or Richard, or anybody else. She was like, in a way, a silent partner, but she was there. And her brilliance and her insight and her constant support were something that were crucial and essential. And I don't think Dick ever did any case or anything like that he didn't work together with Marianne. And it was the relationship was something I've never seen in my life. It was miraculous, I thought. Just the personal relationship and the intellectual relationship, professional, I guess.
And as you can see in the movie, Marianne has, and as those of us know who know them both, she had a very different style and a very different way of looking at all these things. And I think that she fulfilled Richard, and she also complimented him.
I agree.
In that work, Tom, as you say, of changing the world. I'm certainly one of thousands probably who really learned to think about all this by reading that book, and then by reading this book. Yes. And one awesome thing I feel about the movie is, Joe, I think you zeroed in on Richard's mantra of "it's the system," and you even found that great way of using those circular graphics to suggest, which have their kind of have their similar features in Hand of God, as I remember, which also has kind of circular things going on. But you somehow managed to convey with that, and with all the masks in the movie, Richard's concept. You somehow kind of distilled it into visual form, what it was that we all kind of understood as each of us began to work on this.
his mantra, it's the system, goes way back. I mean, he saw that at the beginning. He knew the system, and by system I mean the ecclesiastical system, the institutional church. And what people refer to as the institutional church is really the governmental structure, the governmental system, which is run by bishops and the clergy. That's the institutional church. The lay people are the byproducts and the source of money. Period. So Richard got that from the beginning, and that was the direction. That was the way he looked at cases. That's the way we both looked at cases. Was always trying to fit this into this institutional collusion, and we came up as time went on. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a crisis it was an integral part of the institutional church. All of this was a part of that, of the very fiber of the institution, the way it was created, the way it was sustained, and all of that gave rise over the centuries to this nightmare we call sexual violation of minors or vulnerable people. And Dick knew that from the get-go. And he was not a popular guy with the hierarchy. Of course, I know what that's like, but Dick wasn't, because he was telling the truth. And I often I said to him, these guys are allergic to the truth, Richard, really allergic to it. And so if they start sneezing and coughing, that's what it's all about.
It was doing this film after having come at it from a totally different point of view with Hand of God was very much revealing to me, because certainly when we were doing that, and the outset of that film, when my brother and I kind of discovered what went on with him and with the priests that had abused him and the bishops that covered it up. So that idea of the system to us was a real revelation as we were going through it. And then to do this film where somebody who was so embedded in that system and had been seeing this stuff going on behind the scenes, and probably biting his tongue for some years, but then coming out and talking about it, it was an interesting process. And talking about McCarrick too, because he was working on documents about McCarrick when we were there. And McCarrick was somebody who I worked for, raising money for, making fundraising films for. Before my brother told me what happened to him. I was in the middle of making one when he called me one day and told me the history of his abuse, and I was stopped dead in my tracks. I was like, okay, this guy's a client. Certainly he didn't know about McCarrick, but I knew I was working for that system at that point. And I quickly kind of extricated myself from it and started working on another film for him. But so this film was interesting for me because of that perspective of working on the same subject, but looking at it from a completely different point of view. The people who have been behind the curtain, who have been in that system and then released themselves and then had a tale to tell about it. So, I can't say that before Terry approached me about this that I had any desire to do another film about clergy abuse. But I'm kind of glad that I did. I'm certainly glad that I had the opportunity to spend that much time with Richard and find out about who he was. And I know that when we were making Hand of God, it was very deliberate point that we made not to include experts. And we had obviously, the two people we would have come to would have been Richard and you, Tom. But we were trying to embed ourselves just in that family story and just tell a tale that people lived, as opposed to coming in and bringing a wider point of view, which wasn't really the point of that film. But
well, that was a good call. I mean, the film was about Richard, and that's what it had to be about. And the film showed who he was, and who he was had a profound impact on what he did and how he did it, all of his life. And that was the whole package. I mean, we got the whole package there. Richard's steadfastness, his very sharp intellect, and his sensitivity and his compassionate nature, which was always there, always there. He was, I used to ask him, I said, how can you handle talking to these people with all these problems constantly, and you're always so kind? I said, they drive me crazy. And he always was. He used to say that he thought hearing confessions was one of the most important parts of being a priest, because he could actually help people. And I said, well, man, I got to tell you, I said, to me, that was one of the worst parts, because he had a different approach to it and had different talents than I did. That's for sure, in that regard.
Well, in our chat, there's a couple tales of folks who, I hope it's okay if I read them, but they speak to exactly what you're talking about. Becky wrote, I remember the first time I met Richard, it was at the 2007 SNAP conference. I was in a rough place, having gone through a review board meeting the week before the conference. I was in the elevator escaping to my room, and Richard was in the elevator with me. I didn't say a word, and he took and held my hand and told me I was brave. I will never forget his kindness. And then Lucy writes about, she said, I was lucky enough in 1973 as a senior at Loyola College, now University in Baltimore, to be assigned to Dr. Sipe when I went to the counseling center to deal with family of origin and relationship issues. He was the loveliest, kindest, and smartest therapist, exactly what I've needed. I followed him since then and read all of his books and loved your documentary. His death was a real loss to the survivor movement. So I think that element of Richard's just unfailing kindness and willingness to help and I don't know, that shone through in the film for me, and I know it resonated with folks there, and it's coming out in this conversation for sure. But I figured, with that little bit of chat interaction, it might be a good time, especially as we were just talking about the idea of the system, to ask a couple of the questions that were submitted to us in advance. And one of them I liked, this one I liked because it's pretty raw, and I thought, I don't know, this is a good group of folks to discuss this person's question. But she asked, can any of the panelists shed some light on the politics within the Vatican, with the Pope, the cardinals, and others, as to why all we see is platitudes and promises, yet no meaningful reforms, other than those that they've almost been forced to make? I was always told the Pope is infallible, but there's no way that God or Jesus is guiding his actions. What are the politics within the Vatican? Why don't they do what has to be done in order to protect children?
Who's going to start?
Oh, you got to take that one, Tom.
Okay, I would say this. This is the question is a multi-part question, but it hits the nail on the head. That's the key question: is why has this operation that's supposed to be the body of Christ, with these run by these guys who claim they're descendants of the apostles, who know everything, they have perfect knowledge, yada yada yada. Why have they allowed one of the most horrific strains of crime become a major part of the life of this church since the beginning? Why? And why haven't they made it go away? Why haven't they changed it? Why haven't the bishops treated the victims the way they treat the perpetrators? Why haven't they reached out? Those are questions Richard and I asked each other. And the best answer, I think, is it's deeply embedded in the system that we call the institutional Catholic Church. It's not embedded in the system of Christianity. If the sayings of Christ, the examples of Christ were paramount, if that is the way we made our decisions, and that's what we looked at to form our actions, it would be a completely different ballgame. But what's important is not the sayings and the life of Christ, it's the sustaining the power structure of this institution. That, they say, well, God gave the church the hierarchical model of political structure. That's absolute nonsense. That makes absolutely no sense. There's no historical evidence for that at all. But that's part of the excuse. This system was given to us by God. Everything we do to protect it is absolutely necessary and right. And my response to that is absolutely not. Everything you do to protect it is just destructive, and it's harmful, and it's counterproductive to some of the main things Christ was all about. But as far as a definitive answer that'll make it all change, I really think the only thing that'll make the system, this thing change, is if the system that created and has sustained this nightmare for almost 2,000 years is fundamentally and radically changed. Now that's radical, and that's what it's meant to be. But if the system itself is radically changed, the whole thing, this adulation of priests, this business of bishops being the most important people in the church and all this rigmarole, if that stuff went away, the protections and the enabling factors that make this happen and protect sexual abusers would go away too. Now, they've already done everything they can to me, so they can't do anything more. So all these crazy things I say, fine, it's the truth. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah, that gels with my understanding, which is largely born from your and Richard's work. So thanks for that, Tom. That's it's always good to hear you talk about these. I don't know, Terry, Joe, I didn't want to cut you off if you had anything to say about that question or wanted to opine there. I have another one that is somewhat on a similar wavelength. And yeah, I thought this was an interesting question about, Richard, especially in the film, he talks a lot about celibacy, and that was an important part of his work. And, he knew that priests were having sex with adults as well. What did they think about that? What were the focus on, sexual abuse of women, for example, at the time in the 1980s? Was that secondary to the abuse of children, just not really understood the same way? What would you say about the way that the abuse of adults, which is still an emerging topic today, thought about, at that time?
I'd say briefly that Richard very much anticipated all of these recent developments because his focus was really, yes, he cared passionately about survivors. As we have learned recently, he was one himself. But he also saw the phenomenon of clergy abuse within this larger context of clergy misconduct, within this larger context of priests and brothers and religious sisters' lives, and the lives of all Catholics and Christians. And I think it's Richard's holistic perspective on all of that that really informed his particular work on clergy abuse and gave it the authority that it had. And I think what we're seeing now is that perspective is bearing fruit, that he were around to see it in all of these broadenings of the canvas that we're experiencing now that are so valuable. I don't know if you would agree with that, Tom.
I do. I completely agree with that. I think he saw a lot of this for what it really was. And I think he saw what he saw a lot of others, especially in the system itself, were incapable of seeing because they were so much embedded into the system. And as he and I discussed one day, one of the reasons that the bishops don't stand up is because this hierarchical system, that's their past, their present, and their future. You cancel that ticket, and they're out wandering around, aimlessly, because it takes all of that away. But I think his books, his insights, made eminent sense, and they were very insightful because they saw through to what the core issues were and are. They're not gone. I mean, there's a lot of nice rhetoric that comes out from one end to the other, but it's the actions that count. And I remember when I went over to speak to the Papal Commission on the Protection of Children, which is a joke. Anyway, I went over there and the first thing I said, the victims, and I can speak for them, I'm sure, have had enough apologies, explanations, protocols, programs, explanations, the whole thing. They had enough. What they want is action. So shut up and do something. And we're still waiting. The only guy who's doing anything really is the Pope, but he's one man.
This is a bit of switching gears, but it's a question that we had come up during the session, which I also encourage. Please asking those folks. But Sue asks, Tom, do you recall the work of Ray Mouton in the 1980s in the trial there in Louisiana, and if there was any stories about that, and Richard, that might have come out?
I recall that very well. That's when I got started, was with Ray Mouton. He and I met on a very freezing January day in 1985, and we became and have stayed close friends ever since. The third part of that little group, Michael Peterson, was a priest psychiatrist who passed away, unfortunately, in 1987. And I think that's part of this whole story. Richard was not involved in that. He was on the scene, but he wasn't involved in that at that time, because we didn't know where it was going. We had, the three of us were just kind of bumbling around. And but that's another story. That in itself is still, that whole deal from Louisiana, I think, is to me, the most complicated, the most revealing single one case that I've been involved in, and I've been involved in a lot of them. Ray wrote a book called In God's House. It's a fictional account that's true of what happened. And I would say, if you want to find out about what went on at the beginning, get a hold of that book. It's a fast read. I read, it's the size of a Philadelphia phone book. And I read the whole thing in 3 days. I couldn't put it down. But that was the beginning. And I think a lot of the things Ray Mouton did were revolutionary. They took a lot of guts, a lot of courage, and he was way out there before anybody else had a clue. And I think Ray I know he saw that the system was working on covering up and saving itself. And I was part of the system at the time. I was dedicated, at least for a while. And I remember him saying these things and reflecting on it. And as time went on, I realized he's right. There they are. It's a conspiracy to cover this thing up. They don't care about the kids. That was back in 1985.
And the whole saga of Lafayette and Gothay, and in a way, it's a kind of touchstone of the crisis, as we call it, that we're constantly returning to. So really most people's understanding of the abuse crisis began with Jason Berry's great book, with you, Tom, is pretty much the central character telling that whole story. And then fast forward years and years and years, you have Minnesota Public Radio and Madeline Barron going back down there and looking at Flynn and looking at the story, interviewing people and coming up with new perceptions of that, what's really a foundational story, it seems to me, in the whole abuse crisis. And it's fascinating to think that, as we're living this history, we're also looking back at the history and thinking about it again. And this is a process that will continue. And I think that the making of these movies, including this latest one, is part of that.
That the Lafayette story, Richard was very much, he knew the score. In fact, I was going to school in San Diego in, I think, 99 or 98 at the Naval School of Addiction Counseling. I was studying to be an addiction therapist. And I spent a lot of time with Richard because the school was down at Point Loma and he lived up the coast at La Jolla. But I recall one night, Marianne was in Peru with a couple of her classmates, and Richard and I were alone, and I started telling him, recounting what I knew of what really went on in Lafayette. And we got into a lengthy discussion about it. And I used to often say to myself, I wish he'd have been on the scene then and been in on that mess, because it would have really had a profound impact. And he would have helped the three of us put some direction into what we were doing, because he was ahead of that. He was ahead of the curve on where this was going to go and what needed to happen.
We have another question in the Q&A that I want to get to, but before we do, I want to acknowledge something that was said to chat, mostly because I very strongly agree with it and like the comment. But Patty said, I like how you filmed the natural interaction between Richard and Marianne, her realization that her fighting for Richard was enough for him, even though she thought it was not. Just beautiful being witness to that love for each other and that kindness. And I so agree with that, especially what you said, Tom and Terry earlier about how closely their work together, how important it was that they worked so closely together. And I just absolutely loved those interactions in the film and how they were captured, Joe. I thought that was exceptional. You have a real gift there.
Marianne in herself, she's a remarkable, extraordinary woman in many ways, as a physician, as a psychiatrist. The insight she brought to this whole thing that Dick and I didn't have. She'd been a religious woman in the nunnery in Maryknoll, and then Dick was a Benedictine and I was a Dominican. And so that we didn't have anybody else to talk to because we were the only exes that were in this thing. So we were like our own support group and we shared everything. And it was, I don't know if I'd have survived with what left I've got of my marbles without the two of them. I know that. But Marianne is extraordinary and brought, I can't even describe how much she brought to this whole thing.
I agree with your commenter about how their relationship was presented, both in the La Jolla scenes and also in that scene in Stillwater.
At the end with the whole family.
Yeah. So
the whole family scene was probably my highlight of the film. I mean, the entire thing is wonderful, but that scene, I mean, talk about humanizing in one instant, and his brother Todd, sort of ranting there, and I don't know, I just absolutely loved it. So very well done, Joe.
Yeah, that was special being around that, and clearly Richard was surprised by what he was hearing from his brother. Spoken to him in a while, and the fact that he was so outspoken about this. He turned into Richard for a moment there.
Yeah.
And then there was the other part of the family that was kind of like, yeah, well, it's not all priest, and let's be careful what we say. And so the back and forth with that was so real. And anybody who's had this experience, either from being in a family, a Catholic family, who's had someone who has been abused, and then everyone's trying to navigate both an understanding for that, but also, we don't want to offend the church or the priest or, these people that we care about and grew up with. And so that moment was so real and so reminiscent of so many other places and tables I've been sat around and heard those type of discussions.
Absolutely, well said. Yes, that it was a wonderful moment. I'm so glad that we were able to see that. So we had a couple of questions. These ones going back a little bit to the conversation we were having about the structure of the church. I think I can kind of conflate these. But there's an interesting question about, Tom, how much support you think Pope Francis has for his reforms, as far as, like, for example, recognizing abuse of adults, and do you think there'll be another liberal pope on this issue, or is Francis an aberration here?
Well, he's appointed a number of very interesting people to the College of Cardinals, and that's the key. He's packing the court, and I think, thank God, because whoever succeeds him, if they try going back to where we were before, it's going to be a really humongous mess. But I don't, and of course, I don't have any insights at all anymore. But what I do remember from when I was on the inside is he's dealing with the Vatican Curia, and not even the Lord God can figure that mess out, because there are so many different agendas going on, and they're constantly changing because the personnel are constantly changing, and who they are and who's on their train and who they're supporting and so on. And then the issue is there's this business of sexual abuse it's all through the whole curia. I mean, the sexual relationships and everything else are there, and that drives a lot of that. I suspect I do know that the whole curia, in other words, all the big shots, are not behind Francis because of what he wants to do. He really wants to change that outfit over there significantly and take the power away from the oligarchy and restructure the whole issue. And that is extremely threatening. I mean, that you can tell. I mean, it's very, very threatening. Thank God he's been doing a few things with sexual abuses that's never been done. Nobody ever, I don't say nobody. Benedict did fire some bishops and laicized a couple of bishops, which was extraordinary. I mean, he did a radical turn from JP2, who had exalted the priesthood and the episcopacy way beyond reality. And that's why he protected it. And he became the arch enabler of the whole thing. And then Benedict, I think, he knew what was going on, but he didn't have he wasn't separated enough from the curia. That was his whole life, to make some of these tough decisions. And then Francis comes in and he fired 3 cardinals. He took them out of the College of Cardinals. One was obviously Ted McCarrick, and then he laicized him. And that's what blew my mind, because the last time a cardinal was laicized, and I, at least as far as my research is concerned, the last time a cardinal was laicized was Cesare Borgia, who was ordained a priest, I think, at 14 by his father, who was the Pope. And he wanted to get out of this whole thing because he wanted to become a soldier. So according to the records, no other cardinal has been laicized. They fired a couple. Cardinal B.O. was fired from the College of Cardinals in 1930. And then nothing ever happened to anybody until after the change of the millennium, when Cardinal O'Brien from Edinburgh went, and McCarrick, and then the guy that was involved in the finances, Bichu, what's his name? Is that his name? Bichu, I think. Yeah, he's kind of out of the running too. So I think, Francis is probably isolated in a lot of this. The other thing he's done that no other pope has done, he's actually listened to survivors. He sat down and spent time with them and listened to what they had to say. And he's apologized for mistakes that he's made. No pope ever does that, because they're perfect. They know everything. And everything, even if they don't know it, they know it. And even if they're right, even if they're wrong, they're right, because that's the way the system is. But he kind of turned that around. So that's a good thing. It's a good start. And he can't, that horse is out of the barn and it's not going to go back in.
It's actually a pretty hopeful response there, Tom. Thanks for that. That's nice to hear. So we just have a few minutes left, and what I really wanted to do, first, I had one more quick question that I'm hoping we can answer. I also love the needle points that David references in his question. It was a great part of the film. Did Richard finish the 4-piece that he was working on? Was David's question. No, unfortunately, that's what I was afraid of. Yeah, sorry, David. But with the last few minutes that we have here, I was hoping that each of you might just share, forgive me if this is too personal, but whatever your individual favorite memory of Richard would be, whether that, through working this film or in the course of your working together, just something that you want to leave attendees, thinking about it and remembering Richard. And whoever wants to go first, you can go ahead.
Terry, you look pensive.
So do you, Tom.
I'll start. Okay, I have 2 memories that I have a zillion of them, but 2 stand out. One, he and I were together here in Washington, D.C., and I think this might have been 1995 or so, to give, we were giving depositions in the famous Rudy Koss trial that ended in 1997, which was a huge trial in Dallas. And at the depositions, there was a squadron of lawyers. And the deps went on for about 4 days. One night, Richard and I and Susan went to dinner at a restaurant that was I think it still is, in the the old train station, Union Station in downtown Washington. So we had dinner at the restaurant, nice place. And we get up to leave, and we're walking out to get a car. I think it was my car. And Richard had a suit and tie on. And Susan, who was with us, said, "What's that thing hanging out of your pants?" And he had tucked his napkin in his belt, in his trousers, and he didn't remove it. So we're walking through Union Station, and that's what he was looking like. And we just laughed, and he grabbed the thing, and we said, "Should we give it back to them?" I said, "Keep it as a souvenir." So that's one. And the other memory is very personal, but I'm going to share it anyway. The last thing he said to me was, "Don't ever stop asking why." And I said to him, "I won't, but you're going to find the answer long before I do." And I'll never forget that. And just on the, I guess, on the strength of that statement to me, I'll go till the last dog is hung before I'm done.
Thank you for sharing that. And I believe you, and thank you for your work, Tom.
Yeah, I've got two also. I just have such fond memories of, we see it in the movie, that big round table at the end of the living room, kind of dining room, where he would spread out all the stuff that he was working on when he was doing his expert witness work. And that was such a beautiful room. His needlepoint was there on the wall. And Joe, part of what I love about the movie is how Hugh, the cameraman, pans across those, and they become really a part of the movie. And on the wall facing those were those very haunting crucifixion scenes. And there was even that place where Dick would sometimes kneel down, because he did still kind of read The Office. He had a little book that he would read the readings of the day from. And I think it's good to remember that there was a part of Richard that continued to really love St. John's. And there was a part of Richard that remained a really faithful man of the church, more faithful than a lot of the people whom he was critiquing. And then my second memory is I won't mention his name, but I remember being with Richard and Marianne in that little alcove where that amazing scene, Joe, takes place with Richard and the two survivors. And we were sitting with a survivor who was really struggling, and who would come down and visit. And I think for me, it's always really good to remember how welcoming Richard was to survivors, how much he cared about survivors, and how he was absolutely always in the survivor's corner.
Yeah, just quickly, obviously you two guys knew him a lot more than I did, so I didn't have much more experience than the time I spent with him with a camera over my shoulder. But that what you just said, Terry, was so true in that moment when the survivors were there, and you could see that how Richard was a real people person. And sometimes if you just read his books, you don't get who he is. So I hope that the film at least gave you three things: his story, his study, his work, and himself, the person. And so I was just touched that he opened up so much to us in the short time that we were able to spend with him.
I'm grateful that he did, because the end result is an absolutely beautiful film. And I think, judging by how Terry and Tom have talked about, a real testament to their friend and who he was as a person. I'm just grateful to you for making it, sharing it with us. Terry, thanks for your part. So grateful to each of you for spending this time talking about Richard with us. And it's been a powerful hour for me. I hope it was for the folks watching at home. There's still time to watch the film if you haven't yet. If you need questions, need help figuring out how to do so, please email me, contact me directly through the platform. But beyond that, thank you so much, Tom, Terry, and Joe, for your work and for your time this evening. I'm very grateful to each of you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you for having us. This was a privilege, getting to
Wonderful.
talk about it.